You're fixing to ride the lightning, boy." The words came out slow, almost lazy, like the officer was enjoying the taste of them. Rain hammered the hood of a black Tahoe, parked under the buzzing lights of a gas station on Route 212. A grown man in his 60s knelt on wet concrete, hands cuffed behind his back, chemical fire still burning in his eyes. He said nothing. He was memorizing badge numbers. Rewind, 4 hours. The drive south out of Washington had been quiet, the kind of quiet a man learns to treasure after 40 years of ship horns, engine rooms, and briefings that never end before midnight. Admiral Elijah Marsh, United States Navy, 4 stars on each shoulder when he wore the uniform, sat in a soft navy quarter-zip and gray slacks, driving a leased Tahoe that still smelled like the dealership. Dealer plates were taped neatly inside the tinted rear glass, exactly where the paperwork said they belonged. He was 61 years old. He had commanded a carrier strike group in the Pacific, briefed 3 secretaries of defense, and buried more sailors than he ever let himself count out loud. Tonight, he was just a tired man going home to Coldwater Bend, Georgia, for a long weekend with his wife and a fishing rod that had gathered dust since spring. On the dashboard, wedged into the little tray beside the cup holder, sat a scratched brass challenge coin, edges worn smooth from 30 years of a thumb, running over the same 3 words engraved on its face. Elijah Marsh, steward. It had belonged to his father, a Navy mess cook in 1961, a man who had cooked eggs for officers who would not let him eat in the same room, a man passed over for promotion 4 times, despite a service record cleaner than any of theirs. Elijah Marsh had never made rank. He had made sure his son did. Elijah touched the coin at every red light. It was habit now, older than most of his memories. He was doing 45 in a 55 zone, easing off in the rain, when the lights exploded behind him. Red and blue tore through the downpour like something violent had been let loose. Marsh checked his speedometer twice. He hadn't swerved. He hadn't been speeding. He signaled, looking for a lit place to pull over, the way he'd taught every ensign under his command for 2 decades. Stop somewhere the cameras can see you, somewhere safe for you and for the officer. A BP station glowed half a mile ahead through the sheeting rain. He flicked on his hazards to signal that he'd seen the cruiser and held a slow, steady speed toward the light. Behind him, 26-year-old Officer Wyatt Doss gripped the wheel so hard his knuckles went pale. 2 years out of the academy, and every training scenario he'd ever run was screaming the same word in his skull: fleeing. To Doss, the slow-rolling Tahoe with the dark windows wasn't a cautious driver being careful in the rain. It was a suspect buying time. "Dispatch, Unit 4. He barked into the radio, voice tight as a wire, vehicle failing to yield. Dark SUV, no visible tags mess, proceeding east on 212. Copy. Unit 4, need backup? Affirmative, initiating a high-risk stop. He never noticed the paper tag taped inside the glass. He saw exactly what he expected to see. A mile down the road, Officer Roy Tanner heard the call crackle over his radio and felt something in his chest light up like a struck match. Tanner was 44, 17 years on the force, and known around the department for 2 things: a short fuse and a habit of finding drugs in cars that other officers swore were clean. He floored it, siren screaming, and reached the gas station 40 seconds after Doss. By the time Marsh pulled under the fluorescent canopy, put the Tahoe in park, cut the engine, and rolled down his window with both hands raised to the top of the wheel. Palms flat, fingers spread, exactly where a camera could see them. The situation had already stopped being routine. Doss's cruiser skidded in at an angle behind him. Tanner's door flew open before his car had even settled on its shocks, weapon already drawn, sprinting for the passenger side. "Show me your hands." "Show me your hands right now," Doss screamed, though the Admiral's hands had not moved an inch. "My hands are on the wheel, officer," Marsh said, and his voice did something neither young cop expected. It did not shake. "Get out of the car." Get out of the car now. Tanner bellowed from the passenger window, gun leveled through the glass. I am keeping my hands visible, Marsh replied, level as still water. I am not reaching for anything. I would like to know why I've been stopped. I said, get out. I am afraid to get out, Marsh said, clearly, deliberately, because he knew. He had negotiated hostage situations with far less at stake than this, that somewhere on their chests, a small red light was recording every word. Tanner leaned into the open window, and something in his face shifted from procedure into pleasure. Yeah, he said, almost gently, almost like he meant it kindly. You should be. You're fixing to ride the lightning, boy. An old phrase. Ugly and specific. A reference to an electric chair that hadn't been used in that state in decades, delivered over a routine traffic stop like a punchline. Marsh felt something cold settle into his stomach, the particular cold of a threat spoken by a man wearing a badge and holding a gun. Officer, I am an admiral in the United States Navy, Marsh said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying 40 years of command in it. My identification is in my back pocket. I am not moving until you lower your weapons. I don't care if you're the president, Tanner snapped. He holstered his firearm, pulled a canister from his belt, and without another word emptied a stream of pepper spray directly into Marsh's face. The world went white and then red. Every nerve in his skull screamed at once. He gasped, choking, hands flying up instinctively to claw at eyes that felt like they were dissolving. Tanner grabbed a fistful of his sweater and hauled him bodily out of the vehicle. Marsh hit the wet pavement on his knees. A knee drove into his thigh. Rough hands twisted his arms behind his back. Steel bit into his wrists. Stop resisting, Doss shouted, kneeling on his spine, though the 61-year-old man beneath him had never once fought back. I am not resisting, Marsh wheezed against the oily concrete, and somewhere underneath the pain, underneath 40 years of discipline, finally being tested in a way no war college had ever prepared him for, a single thought surfaced and stayed there like a compass needle. Remember everything. Sit with that for a second, because it matters for what comes later. Everything Marsh said in those 90 seconds, every word, every syllable, he chose on purpose, knowing a camera was watching. He wasn't just surviving the moment, he was building a case. He lay there in the rain, while the officers stood over him, constructing their story in real time, their voices shifting from screamed commands into the low, self-justifying murmur of men rehearsing an explanation. Dispatch, subject in custody, Doss said into his radio, slightly breathless. Send EMS. Subject was exposed to OC spray. I told him to get out, Tanner muttered, mostly to himself. Non-compliant. Had to use force. Forced one swollen eye open. My wallet, he rasped. Back right pocket, look. Tanner sneered and patted him down anyway, more out of habit than curiosity, flipping the leather wallet open under his flashlight. A Georgia driver's license. Behind it, a military ID, not the standard green card of active duty, but the distinct navy blue card reserved for flag officers. And beneath the photograph, 4 small silver stars and 3 letters that stopped every muscle in Tanner's body at once. ADM. The rain kept falling. Nobody moved. It was the kind of silence that has weight to it, the kind you could set a hand on. What is it, Roy? Doss finally asked, noticing his partner had gone completely still. Tanner didn't answer right away. He was doing the math that every cop eventually has to do and never wants to. 4 stars outrank generals. 4 stars have a direct line to people who can end careers with a signature. Get him up, Tanner said quietly. Get him out of the rain. They hauled Marsh to his feet, gentler now, cuffs still locked tight, and leaned him against the hood of the cruiser, while a paramedic named Priya Anand knelt beside him with a jug of saline. Flushing his eyes with the careful patience of someone who had done this exact procedure 100 times and had never once seen the person on the ground look quite this calm. She didn't say anything about the stars on the ID card, sitting open on the hood, 6 inches from her knee. She just kept flushing his eyes, and at one point, without a word, pressed a folded towel into his cuffed hands so he'd have something dry to hold on to. It wasn't much. It was the only thing she had power to give. Lieutenant Frank Bellamy arrived, 8 minutes later, in a Ford Explorer marked Shift Commander, stepped out adjusting his duty belt, and took one look at the scene. A soaked, handcuffed black man being treated by EMS, while 2 young officers stood around, looking like they'd swallowed something jagged. "What do we have?" Bellamy said. Tanner pulled him aside out of the paramedic's earshot and gave him the sanitized version. Failure to yield, refused to exit the vehicle, deployed OC spray, non-compliant. "Any weapon?" Bellamy asked. "No weapon. The tags taped inside the rear glass, hard to see in the rain." Bellamy exhaled slowly. "Who is he?" Tanner handed over the wallet without a word. Bellamy opened it, and his face did the exact same thing Tanner's had. "Admiral Marsh." Bellamy's tone had transformed entirely. Professional now, careful. "I'm Lieutenant Bellamy, Coldwater, Bend PD. Take these cuffs off," Marsh said, steady despite the pain still burning in his eyes. "Now." Tanner unlocked them fast. Marsh rubbed his raw wrists and looked at the man who had sprayed him with the flat, unblinking stare of someone filing away a face for later. "Sir, there's been a significant misunderstanding," Bellamy began, sliding smoothly into damage control. "My officers believed you were attempting to flee. I was looking for a lit place to pull over, as is standard safety protocol. I kept my hands visible and asked why I was being stopped. For that, I was threatened, pepper sprayed, dragged from my vehicle, and assaulted. Sir Officer Tanner deployed OC spray because you failed to comply with a lawful order. Your policy," Marsh said, voice dropping into something low and dangerous, "is apparently to tell a citizen he's fixing to ride the lightning. Do not insult me by pretending this was procedure." Bellamy swallowed. He knew exactly how bad the body camera footage was going to look. "Admiral, look, we could take you downtown, file for obstruction and evading. That creates a paper trail. It reaches your command. It could affect your career." He raised his hands, almost soothing. "Or we cut the cuffs, let EMS finish up, and you drive home tonight. We drop it all. Nobody has to know this happened." It was an old trick, the kind cops use when they know they've overstepped. Threaten a phantom charge, heavy enough to scare a man into silence, then offer him an exit built entirely out of his own fear. They were betting that even a decorated admiral would rather protect his career than fight a police department. "I will not be extorted," Marsh said quietly. "It isn't extortion. It's a courtesy. If I've committed a crime, Lieutenant, arrest me." He held his wrists back out, together. "Charge me. Put it on the record. But know this, I will fight it, and I will demand every second of that body camera footage." Bellamy looked into the Admiral's eyes and saw something that made his stomach drop. No fear at all. Only a cold and settled fury that wasn't going anywhere. "You're free to go, sir," he said finally. "No charges tonight. I need your names, your badge numbers, and the name of your chief," Marsh said, already reaching for the small notepad he kept in his glove box. He wrote it all down, while his eyes still burned and his clothes clung to him, soaked through with rain and chemical spray. And then he climbed back into his Tahoe, rolled down every window to clear the air, and drove off, leaving 3 officers standing under the gas station lights, watching his taillights vanish into the storm. They thought they'd let him go. What they'd actually done was give a 4-star admiral the entire weekend to prepare for war. Monday morning, the Pentagon hummed with its usual controlled urgency. In the outer ring of offices, reserved for the highest-ranking officers, Admiral Marsh sat behind an oak desk in his service dress blues, 4 silver stars gleaming on each shoulder, the only visible reminder of the weekend, a faint redness still lingering in his eyes. Across from him sat his chief of staff, Captain Renata Cole, and his legal counsel, Commander Elena Voss, A sharp, precise woman who had once prosecuted war crimes and did not blink easily. They had just finished watching 45 minutes of body camera footage that Voss had pulled through Naval Criminal Investigative Service channels before Coldwater Bend PD even opened for business that morning. Nobody spoke for a long moment after the screen went dark. "Sir," Cole said finally, "that's assault." "It's worse than that," Voss added, already writing. "Excessive force, unlawful detention, civil rights violations under color of law. They had no probable cause for a high-risk stop, and the threat alone, ride the lightning. That's grounds for termination and criminal charges on its own." Marsh leaned back. "They offered me a deal, Elena. Drop the cuffs, forget it happened, or they'd file charges heavy enough to reach my command." Voss's jaw tightened. Coercion. They knew exactly what they'd done. "No," Marsh said quietly. "They saw a black man in a nice truck and assumed the worst. They acted like they'd never have to answer for it." He stood and walked to the window, looking out over the gray ribbon of the Potomac. "If I take their deal and walk away quietly, I'm telling them this is acceptable. I can't do that. Not for me. Not for the 19-year-old kid driving home from a night shift who doesn't have 4 stars to protect him." He turned back. "Elena, I want a federal civil rights suit drafted against Tanner, Doss, and the town of Coldwater Bend. Renata, get me the chief of police on the line. Before you call the Secretary of the Navy, I want Chief Pruitt first." 10 minutes later, the line connected. Chief Walter Pruitt, 60 years old, and running a department that mostly handled speed traps and shoplifting, had received a vague, softened summary from Bellamy about a misunderstanding with a military officer resolved without charges. He was entirely unprepared for the voice that came through the receiver. "Chief Pruitt, this is Admiral Elijah Marsh, United States Navy." Pruitt sat up straight in his cheap office chair. "Admiral, how can I help you?" "I'm calling about an incident in your jurisdiction Friday night involving officers Tanner and Doss. Lieutenant Bellamy mentioned a stop over a missing tag and some non-compliance. I understand it was resolved without charges. I apologize for any inconvenience." "It was not an inconvenience," Marsh said, cutting through the small talk like a blade. "It was an assault." Silence hummed on the line. "Your officers drew their firearms on a compliant, unarmed motorist. Officer Tanner told me I was, quote, fixing to ride the lightning. He then deployed pepper spray into my face, while my hands were visibly on the wheel, dragged me from my vehicle, and had me restrained on wet concrete. Admiral, I wasn't informed of those specifics. I have the footage, Chief. My legal counsel has reviewed it. What your officers did was not procedure. It was racial profiling and excessive force. Now, let's not jump to conclusions about." "Do not," Marsh said, voice dropping low, "attempt to manage me. I have commanded fleets. I know precisely what a pretextual stop looks like when I've lived through one." He let that land. "I am informing you, as a courtesy, that I am filing a federal civil rights suit against your department and both officers, and forwarding the footage to the Department of Justice with a request to examine broader patterns within Coldwater Bend PD." The line went dead quiet on Pruitt's end. "Admiral, please. A lawsuit like that, the media attention alone, that is precisely the point," Marsh said. "Sunlight is the only disinfectant that's ever worked on this kind of rot." He hung up. Pruitt sat frozen for a full 30 seconds before dialing Mayor Gordon Slate, whose reaction was a string of profanity that lasted almost a minute. "Get ahead of it," Slate barked. "Call the union. Call Ledbetter. We control the narrative before this turns into a national story." Curtis Ledbetter, head of the Regional Police Union, and a man who had built a career turning misconduct into split-second decision talking points, arrived within the hour. "He's bluffing," Ledbetter said, flipping through the incident report. "We've got qualified immunity. Tanner used a non-lethal compliance tool on a subject who refused a lawful order. He has the footage, Curtis." "So do we," Ledbetter said with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. And it's all in how you cut the film. By Tuesday evening, a carefully trimmed 12-second clip found its way to a friendly local news channel. Starting exactly at the moment Tanner screamed at Marsh to get out of the car, cutting away a half-second before the pepper spray. The anchor ran it under a chyron, reading tense standoff on Moot 212, framing the Admiral as an uncooperative driver who'd refused lawful commands during a dangerous night stop. Union officials told the camera the officers had acted by the book. In Washington, Commander Voss burst into Marsh's office holding a tablet playing the broadcast. "Sir, they leaked a doctored clip. They're trying to paint you as the aggressor before we even file." Marsh watched all 12 seconds, without blinking, without a flicker of expression. A strange, chilling calm settled over him, the calm of a man who had expected exactly this from a system built to protect its own. "File the suit first thing tomorrow," he said quietly. "Renata, call the Pentagon press office. Then call the producers at every network that will take our call. Give them the full 45 minutes, both officers' cameras. All of it. Let them see the whole film, not 12 seconds of it." Wednesday morning, the country woke up to a different story entirely. The unedited footage ran on every major network before 9 a.m. The contrast between the leaked clip and the full 45 minutes was staggering. A decorated military officer, hands calm on the wheel, threatened with an execution joke, blinded and thrown to wet concrete. By noon, the hashtag had crossed 1 million posts. The Pentagon issued a rare public statement condemning the department's actions outright. The governor announced a state investigation. The Department of Justice opened a civil rights inquiry into Coldwater Bend PD within the day. Tanner and Doss were suspended without pay, a blow that cracked the union's public stance right down the middle. Ledbetter wasn't finished, though. He knew the public relations war was lost, so he pivoted to the only strategy he had left: destroy the victim's credibility. He hired Vance Holloway, a defense attorney who had built a reputation defending disgraced officers by putting their victims on trial instead. In his first press conference outside the courthouse, Holloway told a wall of cameras that Admiral Marsh believed his rank put him above the law, that his refusal to comply had been calculated arrogance dressed up as caution. Behind closed doors, Holloway filed aggressive discovery motions demanding Marsh's full unredacted service record, subpoenaing medical files, fishing for anything that suggested instability, insubordination, undiagnosed PTSD. Anything to make the Admiral look less like a hero and more like a problem. He badly underestimated Commander Elena Voss. She didn't just fight off the subpoenas, she counterattacked. If Holloway wanted to argue pattern of behavior, she told the federal judge, then the defense would need to open its own records too. The judge agreed. Voss was granted access to 5 years of Coldwater Bend PD's internal communications, emails, dispatch logs, and every officer's departmental text thread. 2 weeks later, in a sterile conference room in Savannah, Officer Roy Tanner sat beside Holloway for his deposition, looking noticeably smaller than the man who had stood over Marsh in the rain. Voss walked him gently through his training, his understanding of the use of force continuum, his definition of a high-risk stop. Tanner, coached well, stuck to a script. He'd felt threatened. The tint was suspicious. The non-compliance felt like a precursor to violence. Then Voss opened a thick manila folder. "Officer Tanner, are you familiar with a group chat titled The 212 Toll Booth?" Tanner went pale before he'd even answered. Holloway leaned forward, sensing disaster. I don't recall," Tanner stammered. "Let me refresh you," Voss said, sliding a printout across the table. "This chat includes yourself, Officer Doss, Lieutenant Bellamy, and 5 other current officers. 4 months ago, you wrote to the group. Bagged another out-of-stater in a tinted Benz tonight. Had him shaking." Officer Doss replied with a trophy emoji. Holloway slammed a hand on the table. "Objection. This is character assassination. Entirely irrelevant." It goes directly to pattern and practice. Counselor, Voss said, never taking her eyes off Tanner. And it gets worse. 10 minutes before you pulled over Admiral Marsh, Officer Doss ran his temporary plate through the system. It came back, registered to a residence in a wealthy zip code in Washington, D.C. Doss texted you, got a live one. Fancy address, no front tag. Let's make him sweat. Tanner stared at the page, mouth opening and closing with nothing coming out. You knew he wasn't a threat, Voss said, her voice sliding into flat, absolute condemnation. You didn't pull him over because you suspected a crime. You pulled him over for sport. You and your colleagues turned that stretch of highway into your own personal hunting ground. Holloway grabbed Tanner by the arm. This deposition is over. My client is invoking his Fifth Amendment right. Walk out if you want, Voss said coldly, closing her folder. This transcript goes straight to the Justice Department investigators who arrived in town this morning. You tried to put the Admiral's character on trial. You just handed us the evidence to take apart your entire department. As Tanner practically fled the room, Voss picked up her phone and typed a single word to Marsh. Checkmate. The next morning, a fleet of black SUVs from the DOJ's Civil Rights Division descended on Coldwater Bend. FBI agents, carrying empty evidence boxes, into a building that had gone from routine speed trap headquarters to federal crime scene overnight. They seized hard drives, personnel files, and every officer's department-issued phone. Inside City Hall, Mayor Slate paced his office, screaming at the town's insurance underwriters, who were threatening to drop Coldwater Bend's liability coverage entirely. Chief Pruitt locked his office door and started drafting a resignation letter he hoped might save his pension. And in a cheap motel room outside town, Officer Roy Tanner sat across from Curtis Ledbetter, finally understanding exactly how alone he was. Joe, we need to talk about damage control, Ledbetter said, using the wrong first name out of sheer nervousness, then correcting himself. Roy, the DOJ is preparing federal deprivation of rights charges. The union's going to say you went rogue, acted outside your training, outside the scope of your employment. Tanner felt the air leave his lungs. You're throwing me under the bus. You told me the union had my back. The union protects the badge, Ledbetter said, without a trace of sympathy. Right now, you're a liability to it. Prepare yourself for prison time. Tanner stumbled out of that motel room and didn't go home. Instead, he drove straight to the FBI field office and asked to speak to someone about a cooperation agreement. By the next afternoon, Voss walked into Marsh's Pentagon office with a grim, satisfied look. Sir, Tanner flipped. The union tried to burn him, so he walked right into the FBI before they could finish the sentence. He's cooperating fully. Regarding our stop? Bigger than that, Admiral. Much bigger. She set a folder on his desk. He's describing a systemic pattern going back years. The mayor and the chief directed illegal quotas, specifically targeting out-of-state drivers, disproportionately minorities, using tinted windows and temp tags as pretext, inflated citations, aggressive towing fees. Asset forfeiture used to fund the town's operating budget. It wasn't law enforcement, sir. It was a shakedown wearing a badge. Marsh closed the folder slowly. And Doss? Indicted this morning, along with 4 other officers in that chat thread, plus Pruitt and Slate. The DOJ is freezing the town's accounts, wire fraud charges pending against the mayor. Good, Marsh said, standing and smoothing his jacket. But criminal charges alone aren't enough. People go to prison. The system rebuilds itself with new faces in the same chairs. We need to pull the foundation out completely. The settlement conference took place in a windowless federal building in Savannah, air conditioning humming at a temperature that matched the mood of the room exactly. Coldwater Bend, facing total municipal bankruptcy, and abandoned by its own insurers, sat across a mahogany table represented by 3 pale, visibly sweating emergency attorneys. Mayor Slate and Chief Pruitt were absent, both currently in federal holding, awaiting bail hearings. Commander Voss stood at the head of the table and laid out the terms with the flat efficiency of a military briefing. "Gentlemen, we're not here to negotiate," she began. "Admiral Marsh has no interest in personal profit from the corruption of your municipality. The civil penalty is set at $7.4 million. One of the city attorneys audibly gasped. "Commander, the town simply doesn't have that kind of capital. A judgment that size forces dissolution. That is the consequence of funding your town through racially targeted extortion," Voss replied. "However, the full amount will go into an irrevocable trust. Not $1 to the Admiral personally. It will fund a permanent legal aid clinic, the Route 212 Civil Rights Initiative, providing free representation to victims of unlawful stops and asset forfeiture across the entire state. You will be funding the very organization built to dismantle departments like yours." She flipped a page. "Additionally, Coldwater Bend PD will operate under a federal consent decree for the next 15 years. Every hire, every use of force report, every routine stop audited, signed today, or we go to trial and this town ceases to exist as a legal entity." The lead attorney's hands shook as he uncapped his pen and signed away what remained of the town's corrupt foundation. When the city's lawyers had cleared out, only Marsh, Voss, and a single U.S. Marshal remained. "It's done, Admiral," Voss said quietly. Marsh nodded once. "Bring him in." The door opened, and Roy Tanner walked through it, unrecognizable from the man who had stood in the rain with a gun drawn on an unarmed motorist. He was out on federal bail awaiting sentencing that would almost certainly put him away for over a decade, wearing an ill-fitting gray sweater, shoulders curled inward like he was trying to disappear into himself. He sat across from the Admiral, who stood in his service dress blues like something carved out of granite, 4 silver stars catching the fluorescent light. Marsh let the silence stretch, a full minute. Then, too, he wanted Tanner to feel the entire weight of the room settle onto his shoulders before a single word was spoken. "Look at me, Mr. Tanner." The voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Tanner raised his head slowly, eyes bloodshot, and couldn't hold the Admiral's gaze for more than a second before dropping it to his own trembling hands. "When you pulled that vehicle over on that highway," Marsh said, each word deliberate, "you did not see a fellow citizen. You did not see a man you had sworn an oath to protect. You saw a target, an older black man you believed you could frighten and extort, because you'd convinced yourself that the badge on your chest made you untouchable." Tanner's throat worked. A tear slid down his cheek and dropped onto the table. "Admiral, I lost my way. The quotas, the culture. I was just, do not insult me by blaming culture." Marsh cut in, voice cracking like a whip across still water. "I have commanded thousands of sailors in situations where their lives were in actual danger. And I have demanded more discipline from a 19-year-old on his first deployment than you managed in your entire career." He leaned forward, closing the distance between them. "You drew a weapon on a compliant man. You threatened to execute me with a joke about an electric chair. You blinded me with a chemical agent while my hands were empty and visible, and you put my face in the mud." His voice dropped lower, quieter, and somehow that made it worse. "But you did not break me, because real authority was never in the barrel of that gun, and dignity isn't something you can take from a man with your hands." Tanner was openly weeping now, face in his hands, shoulders shaking. "You're going to federal prison," Marsh continued, unmoved. "You'll lose your freedom, your pension, your reputation, and the right to ever wear a badge again. I asked to see you today so you would look, one last time, at the face of the man who ended it. I want you to remember it in that cell. I want you to remember that when you went looking for someone to frighten, you picked the wrong highway." He stood, adjusted his white cover, and turned toward the door without waiting for a response. "Commander Voss, our business here is finished. He walked out through the heavy glass doors into blinding Georgia sunlight, the challenge coin in his breast pocket, pressing flat against his chest, and climbed into the back of a waiting staff car that would take him to a fleet, still waiting on his orders. 6 months later, the Route 212 Civil Rights Initiative had already taken on 11 cases across the state. Drivers who'd been stopped for nothing more than the color of their skin or the tint of their windows. Drivers who never had 4 stars to protect them and never would have gotten a hearing without one. Coldwater Bend PD operated now under a federal monitor who reviewed every stop within 72 hours. Officer Doss, the rookie who had initiated the call that started it all, pled guilty to a lesser charge, resigned from law enforcement entirely, and now worked as a warehouse supervisor 2 counties over, a quiet, permanent exile he had built for himself. Roy Tanner was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison. In his allocution, for the first time, he did not blame training, culture, or fear. He said only, "I knew what I was doing. I did it anyway." It was the first true sentence he had spoken since the night on Route 212. On a quiet Sunday morning at Coldwater Bend's small municipal cemetery, Admiral Elijah Marsh stood alone at his father's grave, the brass coin resting in his open palm, Isaiah Marsh's name catching the early light. He didn't say anything out loud. He didn't need to. He closed his fingers around it, put it back in his breast pocket, and walked back to his truck through wet grass that no longer belonged to anyone who'd tried to make it a hunting ground. If this story reached something in you, not because of how it ended, but because you recognize someone in it, hit that like button so it finds the person who needs to hear it. Share it with someone who could use the reminder that they are not invisible. And leave a comment. Have you ever stood in that room on either side of it? I read every single one.